Muchas gracias, Susana. Buenos días a todas. And that is the total sum of my Spanish. So good morning, everybody, or I think nearly good afternoon. Thank you again for the invitation to speak to you here today. It's a real privilege to be able to share with you some of the insights around European labelling rules for prepacked foods and how that is informing consumer choice. But before I kick off, I'd just like to say a little bit more about the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. We have a vision, and a vision is safe and trustworthy food for everyone. And we have a mission which effectively is translating that vision into how we're going to do what it is we need to do. And it is about, first and foremost, protecting consumers. We do this by leading a collaborative food safety community to continuously raise food standards and create a culture of excellence. We are first and foremost an organization that is about protecting consumers, but we recognize that protecting consumers is something that we have to do in collaboration and in partnership with others. As I said earlier, we leverage science to inform our risk assessments and to support our risk management decisions. That science comes from an internal capability and capacity that we have within the organization. And indeed also the scientific committee that we have set up under legislation that supports the Food Safety Authority of Ireland to do risk assessments around biological safety, chemical safety, and public health nutrition. So much of our interaction at European level in the development of legislation is very much based on science. Science at the outset in terms of understanding and informing and influencing the technical development of the legislation, but indeed also then looking to our expertise within the organization about how that legislation is enforced. Because there's not much point in having science-based regulation that is unenforceable. We have to be able to enforce the legislation on the ground through the various different systems we have within Europe. So to kick off around European labelling rules, they're for prepackaged foods and are intended to support consumers in making informed choices about the foods that they purchase and they consume. So the rules I'm going to speak to you about today were developed following a consultation by the European Commission in 2006. And the consultation was based on a paper which is available to download from the website. It was developed by the European Commission, but it was developed because the European Commission recognized that in Europe there were many, many rules affecting labels, and that there was much debate about the proper use of these labels and the best parameters for labeling. Labeling, we must say, is an important tool for marketing, and it must be viewed as an integral part of communication between the various different players, business to consumers directly and via intermediaries, authorities, and from authorities to consumers. But it's no longer the only reliable route for communicating information to consumers, as it once was, but it is a very effective tool. And the benefits of consumer information in general and labeling are particularly clear. For the consumer, it provides a means for the operator, the food business operator, to pass on essential information about products, such as use-by dates and safety warnings, as well as information which, while perhaps not essential, is considered useful, for example, around nutrition recycling, or nutrition labeling, and also recycling. I think for the industry, labeling is also a very powerful tool when used effectively and responsibly, and I very much liked Samuel's slide around the fact that this is a partnership. Food safety and nutrition systems are a partnership. They require industry to act responsibly, they require consumers to act responsibly and understand the risks associated with the foods that they consume and purchase. And there is absolutely a responsibility for government to make sure that we manage and mitigate that risk where possible, or indeed remove it, which is much more beneficial. So I hope that by the end of my talk you will have learned a little bit more about the labelling rules in place in Europe. But I'll also share with you some specific resources that my organization has put in place to support food businesses, to make sure that they can comply with the legislation, and also to help the food safety inspectors who enforce the law about their requirements to enforce the legislation. I will also provide some insights into the outcomes of inspections that have taken place regarding labelling since 2011 within Ireland. So to kick off the presentation, really, it's about an overview of the principles, some information about mandatory information on labels, specifically looking at allergen information, talking to you a little bit about nutrition information, and then indeed also talking to you, as I said earlier, around the resources that we have in place, and indeed some of the enforcements that have taken place in the area of labelling since 2011. But effectively, the legislation that is operational within Europe is Food Information for Consumers, and it is 1169 of 2011, and came into place in 2011, but came into force in 2014. It effectively amended 2 existing regulations and repealed a number of regulations. And as I said, it came into force in 2014, but there are a number of elements of the legislation that are going to come into force specifically around nutrition in December of this year. Some of the principles of the legislation, and this is specifically just comparing the old regulatory environment with the new regulations, and the new regulations, I mean the food information to the consumer. And effectively, the table just shows you what's there within the new versus what was in the old. And specifically pointing out country of origin labels, and there's been a huge amount of discussion, debate, consultation, and now action in the area of country of origin labeling, specifically with respect to meat products, but indeed it's been extended out to fruit and vegetables as well. And indeed on the nutrition declaration, I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. And effectively, up until recently, up until this legislation, that was voluntary, and now it has become mandatory, or will become mandatory from December of this year. But I think it's important for us to understand what we mean by information. When we say food information to the consumer, what is it that we mean? It's information concerning a food and made available to the final consumer by means of a label, other accompanying material, and any other means including modern technology, tools, or verbal communication. Incredibly interesting when you think of some of the discussion that was presented in Samuel's presentation around high risk to low risk, and the amount of advice, the amount of information, the amount of resources, and the different ways in which you can deal with particular problems using a regulatory framework. And moving on into terms of the principles around this, it must not mislead. So any information that you are giving to a consumer must not mislead that consumer. It must be clear, it must be unambiguous, it must be legible and very easy to understand, and it must be in English when it's in Europe, and indeed other languages are also permitted, but it must be at least in English. And it's important that all these principles are adhered to, so every time a label is developed, it has to be looked at from the point of view of being clear, unambiguous, legible and easy to understand, and in the language that it is appropriate. It applies to a number of different types of foods. It applies to prepackaged foods, it applies to foods that are traded business to business, and indeed it also has derogations for certain foods. Certain foods, including loose foods, and indeed those sold or prepared to the consumer, or packed at the premises at the request of the consumer. So moving on then, this is an infographic, actually, that is taken from the European Commission's materials on their website, which I think is relatively simple for us to understand, but it points very much to easier to read information on allergens, information on engineered nanomaterials, and information on specific vegetable origin of refined oils and fats. I think this encapsulates the principles of the legislation very, very clearly, and makes it easy for people to look at, to understand when referring to it in terms of development of the labels. But there are compulsory requirements with respect to prepackaged foods, and I've just listed them here on the slide. And I think particularly of interest, indeed, and I probably pressed the wrong button. Oh, here we go. But you have indeed the name of the food, obviously list of ingredients with allergens. And this is particularly important over the last number of years because we do have a number of groups within the population who are either food intolerant or indeed suffer severe allergic reactions to foods. And indeed this provides a huge amount of information to consumers and makes sure that those consumers can make choices that will benefit them. And indeed the other piece, if I can find it here, is around the mandatory nutrition labelling and the declaration, and that's from December 2016. What I will say in Ireland is any time there's a piece of legislation coming into force, We do a huge amount of work in advance to develop the resource materials, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. But indeed also what we do is we do consultations. So we consult with the various stakeholders through a web-based public consultation, and very much in line with what was said this morning around needing to engage the various different stakeholders to make sure that the legislation was enforceable, and that its objectives were going to be achieved through the implementation of that legislation. But of course, everything in Europe is not as simple as we would like it to be, considering we have 28 countries, quite a complex institutional system. But when it works, it really does work. But in respect to the information to the consumer legislation, you also have to look at other pieces of legislation specifically around animal products, for example, where there's an identification mark required on meat. Looking at legislation with respect to special compositional requirements, for example, in terms of jams, chocolates, honey. Mandatory origin labelling with respect to beef, pig, sheep, lamb, poultry, fruit and veg. Certain other production methods, for example, if the product was produced as a result of genetically modified or from genetically modified organisms, or irradiation was used, or they're organic products, this information also has to be put or considered on the label. And indeed certain ingredients, for example, where they're talking about sweeteners or high caffeine or various different packaging gases are used. So it's not just about using food information to the consumer legislation only, there are other elements to the legislation that are referred to within the FIC legislation that have to be considered. And this next slide talks about distance selling, and not alone do you have to provide information to on labels to those products that you're directly selling to the consumer at the point of sale, over the shop counter, or indeed in restaurants. You have to provide this mandatory information when people are purchasing product over the internet, and this is an incredibly difficult area for us to regulate, but it is an area that we're specifically looking at within the FSAI over the next 12 months in order to understand how we can work with the various different parties that would be involved in distance selling and how we can regulate within that space. And it's also a conversation we're having with other member states right across the European Union, and indeed beyond where appropriate. But this is an infographic that is again taken from the European Commission's resources, and again it points to the fact that information needs to be clear and unambiguous, and it needs to provide that information before the customer makes that purchase. Because if the customer has made this purchase and then receives the information, therefore they're not complying with the legislation. I'd just like to talk a little bit about allergens, and as I mentioned earlier on, this is a specifically difficult area. It's a very challenging area, but it's a very, very important area from a public health perspective. We know that there are many, many parts of the population who are suffering from food intolerance, as I said, or indeed can suffer severe allergic reaction to specific ingredients. So this legislation made it mandatory to put the allergens on the label, and there are 14 allergens that are defined within the legislation, and there are 5 of them highlighted here, and this is an example of a label where allergens have been declared. So, 5 of them have been declared. So we have soya, wheat, metabisulfate, peanut, celery. The other allergens that have to be declared are other nuts, for example, almonds, crustaceans, mollusks, mustard, sesame seeds, milk, lupin, eggs. All of these 14 allergens are defined in the legislation and must be declared on the label. If they're not, then there's a non-compliance, and the company has to be, obviously, an enforcement action has to be taken against them. But it is incredibly important, and I'm sure many of you have or either know somebody who suffers from a food intolerance. I do myself, and indeed the information that she gets is critically important to having her live a healthy and very, very comfortable life. And indeed, when she's exposed to allergens, she's a celiac, and indeed when she's exposed to cells, she gets incredibly sick, as I'm sure many of you know already. This requirement was extended to non-pre-packed foods back in 2015, if I recall correctly. But at a minimum, it must be provided in written format at the point of presenting the product, at the point of sale, or at the point of supply. And the information can also be provided verbally. So when you go into a restaurant in Ireland, you now are entitled to access information with respect to the allergens that are in the non-prepacked food that you are sold. And you get that information in a number of different ways. And indeed, these are some examples of menus whereby the allergens are declared on the menu. This is beer, obviously a staple of the Irish diet, and indeed many European diets, again containing barley, which is obviously a source of gluten. Indeed, if you're going to a wedding and your wedding cake has been produced by a non-family member, that information has to be provided on the table next to the wedding cake. And indeed, if you're going to a fish and chip shop, which many people in Ireland and indeed the UK enjoy on a regular basis, perhaps on a Friday evening, when coming home from the pub, having consumed the gluten-free beer, they will obviously want to have access to information around allergens as well within the foods that they're about to purchase. And indeed, it also extends to farmers' markets. So in Ireland, we have a tradition and a culture, and it's similar right across Europe, indeed, where people can go to markets, and you have them here, I'm sure, as well. Indeed, when I was walking through St. Elmo yesterday, I noticed a number of food sellers walking up and down and selling product. I didn't really want to ask, but I kind of really did want to ask whether or not they could give me any information on the ingredients within it, and indeed whether or not any of those ingredients were allergens. But this is incredibly important that consumers can have this information before they do make their purchase, so they're making that informed purchase and therefore are able to make the decision that will make sure that they stay as healthy as possible. Now I just want to move on to the nutrition information, and as I said, that is going to become mandatory from December this year. Up until now it is voluntary unless a company is wishing to put a health or nutrition claim on the label. And you talked a lot about it. I've heard a lot of discussion about nutrient profiles over the last 24 hours, in fact, since I've been meeting with my colleagues who were on the panel. And obviously nutrient profiles is a major part of the European legislative framework, and indeed it is an area that has been avoided by many within the European system because it is such a contentious issue. And indeed, at the moment, we're waiting for a report to come from the European Commission, a report that is going to be produced by a consultant. And hopefully that report will give us some insight into what way we need to move within Europe. It is very, very political. There are many members of the European Parliament who do not want nutrient profiles. There are many companies who are saying that they will not be able to achieve the reformulation required in order to meet the nutrient profiles. And indeed, there's been many research investments within Europe in projects to look at this labelling issue with respect to nutrient profiles again. And the jury is really out within Europe as to whether or not nutrient profiles will make it easier or less easy for consumers to make an informed choice. That said, we await the outcome of the Commission report, and we hope that it will give us some insight to at least allow us to settle the debate and discussion with respect to nutrient profiles. You'll probably know that nutrient profiles have been brought into place within New Zealand, and indeed they use those as a basis to understand what kind of products can have a health and nutrition claim. I just want to say a couple of words about reformulation before moving on to this mandatory nutrition declaration. And in Ireland, actually, we released our obesity policy and action plan. It was the first obesity policy to be launched last week. And it sets out a commitment with respect to reformulation within the industry. Indeed, the industry in Ireland has been doing a huge amount of work on reformulation. They have reformulated products to reduce salt, and they've done that over the last 10 to 15 years quite successfully. They're now starting to work on fats, sugars as well. And we look forward to working with the industry in order to set realistic targets that they can achieve and that can also meet the public health goals. But I do believe that we are in for a fairly difficult time in terms of the discussions we're going to be having with industry and indeed with the public health system, because the targets that are being talked about are in some cases very, very difficult for the industry to achieve with the kind of technologies and with the kind of ingredients that they have available to them. So innovation is critically important in terms of being able to support the industry to achieve the reformulation targets that will be set. But I suspect this will be a conversation that we'll be having with industry and other stakeholders for a long time to come. But indeed, they are very committed, in fairness, in Ireland in the industry to reformulate. So this is an example of the mandatory nutrition declaration. So from December of this year, every product that is sold to a consumer will have to have this information on the label. It is decided to go 100 grams per mil because it allows for comparison between one product and indeed another. There's additional information that can also be provided on the label if a manufacturer decides to do so, where it includes further information on fats and also in terms of carbohydrates, fiber, vitamins and minerals. It's interesting also that there's a big conversation going on within Europe and I'm sure globally around the maximum tolerable upper limits for vitamins and minerals, and this is something that we within the Food Safety Authority of Ireland are working hard on with our scientific committee and our internal scientific expertise. And we hope that in the coming months, if not, well, at least by early next year, we'll have a publication that will have been signed off by our scientific committee in the area of maximum upper limits for vitamins and minerals. And indeed, all the publications on the FSAI website from our scientific committee are available to download for free. This is a closed list, and other nutrients cannot be added. If a health or nutrient claim is authorised and applies to a non-listed nutrient substance, then the amount must be declared near to the nutrient declaration. But all of this is very clearly laid out within the legislation. And in addition, not alone do we have mandatory, but we also have an opportunity to put voluntary nutrition information, and we can do that on front of pack. And so there's been many discussions within Europe, and I'm sure you'll have seen a number of them in the media, and indeed you probably have been following a number of them over the course of the last number of years. But indeed, this is an example of what information can be put on the front of the pack with respect to energy, or energy plus fat, salt, sugars, and saturated fats. But I think what's interesting is the different approaches that have been taken by the various different countries. So this is something that we use in Ireland. It's a publication by the Irish Health Foundation, and it effectively is what you can see as the traffic light system here on the thing, on the resource, and it provides a food shopping card which helps consumers make that informed choice when they're in the supermarket and they're looking at the products on the shelf and they're trying to make decisions to help them have a healthier lifestyle. This is an example of the French system, and as you may know, the French are currently piloting 4 different types of voluntary labelling system. Again, it's based on a traffic light system, again, looking at the various different contributions of the various different nutrients, etc., within the product. And indeed, this is the one that the UK is using, which is the traffic light system. And again, Ireland, through its obesity policy and action plan, has committed to reviewing the nutrient labelling situation within Ireland and coming up with what we expect will be probably very similar, if not the same, to the UK system. And the reason being is that we trade so much with the UK, and indeed we export a huge amount of our food products to the UK, and indeed they also export a huge amount of their products. We share many of the same retailers, we share many of the same food business operators, so indeed it probably makes sense for us to be fairly similar. You can imagine how difficult this is going to be in the next number of years now as we start to look at our trading relationship with the UK, considering the UK's decision to exit the European Union. So at the moment we're building very strong relationships with our UK counterparts to make sure that we are able to do the kind of assessment and the analysis that will be required in order for us to be able to make sure again that we're in a position to protect consumers and to give them the information that they need to make informed choices. As I mentioned earlier on, the Food Safety Authority produces a number of resources to support compliance within the industry and to help the food inspectors. And this is part of that high risk to low risk paradigm that Samuel referred to. And it's about providing advice, it's providing information to consumers, and indeed also to food businesses. These are just a couple of examples of the various different publications that we have that you can download from the website. So in some respects, when we're talking about specific products, for example, labelling of fruit juices and related products, we have a publication around that. I referred earlier on to specific labelling requirements around jam, jellies and marmalades. We also have something with respect to labelling and hygiene guidelines for producers of small quantities of hen eggs. This is where basically you have small producers who are basically just selling a number of eggs at a farmer's market or supplying to a store in their area. And indeed then also we produce these guidance notes which help the industry in terms of how to look at the term butter. So butter, you might think is butter, but butter isn't just butter. It can be buttery, it can be butterly, it can be every other variation of butter you want. So this caused a huge amount of confusion within the system, within consumers, but it also created a huge amount of opportunity for food businesses to use the term butter when in fact what the product they were selling was not butter, and therefore was misleading and misinforming the consumer. These guidance notes, we have many of them, but we developed them in consultation with industry. We do not develop them on our own. We develop them in consultation with the stakeholders, so be it industry or indeed also be it with the food safety inspectors. And these are some of the other resources specifically with respect to labelling. One is around advice for caterers on the country of origin beef labelling requirements. This is, again, hugely interesting discussion at the moment, especially because we have the Republic of Ireland obviously shares the island of Ireland with Northern Ireland, and indeed we have a huge amount of trading that goes north and south of the border. We are effectively the only land border with the European Union. And indeed, that land border now becomes not a land border with the European Union when the UK invoke Article 50 with respect to leaving the European Union. And we understand that this is going to create a huge amount of challenges because consumers expect when they purchase Irish beef that it is Irish beef. And in fact, we've just completed a huge investigation within the Food Safety Authority where we found that there was people bringing in, there was companies bringing in beef from Eastern Europe and from Germany, bringing it into Ireland and labelling it as Irish and selling it on as a premium product. And indeed that's obviously fraud, and it's something that we've been investigating and indeed has come to conclusion in terms of penalties and an enforcement action taken against the food business. We also prepared, because we knew it was going to be a challenging piece of legislation, a document on food information on pre-packed foods. And I have some copies there which I'll leave with Susanna, but they're just examples of the types of materials that we develop within the FSAI. Indeed, these are others where respect to if you're going to say GMO, what does it mean? Novel foods, organic foods, again, very small leaflets, fact sheets that help consumers and indeed food businesses and also the inspectors to make sure that they have the information they need. This is one that's particularly important, again, around allergen information for non-pre-packed foods. And this just tells the food business, the food caterer, what their requirements are under the legislation when they are selling direct to the consumer. And indeed, every food service operator is looking at this differently. Some of them have folders next to the till. When the customer comes to buy the food, they say, can you tell me what allergens are in this? And the folder is given to the consumer and they read through it, which is quite onerous. Other food safety operators have taken it a different perspective, and they now provide the information. For example, if you're at a buffet and you can choose salads and various different other parts to your meal, then the information is again provided to you at that point before you actually make a decision that this is the food I'm going to eat. It's a particularly interesting area to try and enforce, and indeed something that we're going to have to look at how we can enforce over the next number of years. One of the goals of the FSAI is to go digital first wherever we can. And indeed, this is a piece of work that we did over the last number of years, and it is called MenuCal. It is an online application, and it was developed to assist Ireland's food service businesses to identify and manage allergen information and calculate calories for their menus. It initially started off about calories on menus, and it was really to help food service operators understand the number of calories within their menu, that they could then provide that information to the consumer so the consumer could make that choice in terms of a healthy, balanced diet. And when the allergen legislation then came out, we decided to upgrade and update the application to include allergen information. So now a chef can go in and put in the ingredients of the particular dish that they're going to make. And the information that comes back out will be what are the calories in that dish, and indeed what are the allergens in that dish. So they're giving that information again to the consumer to help them make that informed choice. And over the next couple of months, we're going to be doing a huge amount of promotional work around this. Up until now, we've really not done a huge amount of promotion because we've been working on the technology side of things and the data behind all of this. It's free for any food service operator to register. We don't hold very detailed information on who's registering. We just hold the information around the category. But also there's a whole load of training that's available as well. And indeed, this is interesting because one of the other things that the Irish government has decided they're going to do is they're going to bring in legislation in the next 12 months around calorie posting on menus. So we don't understand fully what the implications of that legislation will be yet, but we do know that the food service operators will be required to put calories on menus, and indeed we hope that this is the application that they will use to help them make sure that they provide the right information and accurate information to consumers. We do a huge amount of work in the area of e-learning resources, and these are resources that are again freely available that you can go in if you want to yourself and do the learning module. We have one on food information for pre-packed foods, and indeed we have another one on nutrition information under food information to the consumer. Again, making sure that we have the resources available to all stakeholders for them to fully inform themselves of what are their requirements under the legislation. And this is the web link to it, but indeed if you just Google fsai.ie, you'll get straight to our website and you can look at all of these resources yourself. One of the wonderful things I have within the organisation is an advice line. We have 2 people who effectively answer about 12,000 calls on a yearly basis. And those calls are a mix of complaints, a mix of information, a mix of requests for information on legislation from food businesses, from inspectors, etc. And indeed, in 2015, we did 11,832 calls to the advice line. We have a timeline, so they get answered within 15 seconds. And then we have, sorry about the quality, but if you can go in and download our annual report, you'll find this in detail. We use webinars also to communicate with the various different stakeholders, and then we do an awful lot of work within the press office, within the FSAI around press releases, making sure we're getting that information out to the various different stakeholders. I promised that I would give you some insight into the enforcement of this legislation, and this effectively gives you a picture of the number of inspections that have taken place every year since 2011, and it also indicates the number of non-compliances. We're sitting at the same level of non-compliances. Now, you must remember that this is a picture taken during a period when Ireland was coming out of recession, and in fact 2011 we were deep in recession. So we had a reduction in the number of food businesses, we had a reduction in the number of food inspectors, and thankfully that's changing. We have a big growth in the industry, and indeed we also have an increase in the number of inspectors who are now coming on stream in order to make sure that we can enforce the legislation appropriately. But indeed what you see is a fairly steady rate of non-compliance. Now we have to look at as an organisation and whether or not we're happy with having that level of non-compliance. Is this okay? Is it okay to have this level of non-compliance within the system? We would like to achieve a situation whereby we have 0 non-compliance and that everybody is 100% compliant, but indeed that's not possible. But we will do everything we can to make sure that we drive compliance as near to 0 as we possibly can. These are some numbers, and I don't expect you to read the detail, but indeed all it does is down the left-hand side, it has, for example, the HSE EHS, that is our health service executive, the environmental health service, who are the inspectors who go out and inspect many of the 49,000 food businesses we have. And this is really a snapshot of the number of different non-compliance or the non-compliant inspections versus the compliant inspections over the period, and it's just a different representation of the graph. But indeed what it does is it breaks down information with respect to beef, for example, fish labelling, general labelling, traceability. What you can see is in traceability we have a significant increase in non-compliant inspections around traceability in 2013, and indeed growing over the following 2 years. This is possibly as a result of the fact that we had the horse meat scandal in 2013, which was discovered by the Food Safety Authority. And indeed, some of the gaps really are respect to the fact that this legislation wasn't in place then, but indeed then we started looking at it in terms of the inspections and the inspection reports. One of the things we have committed to over the next number of years within the Food Safety Authority is making sure that we're extracting the most pertinent information from these inspections in order to help us to make the right risk management decisions. And then in relation to food incidents, I just pulled out some information with respect to what went on within the authority. We on average deal with about 600 food safety incidents over the course of the year. A number of them have literally arisen as a result of foreign bodies, for example, in the food, some chemical or microbiological contamination of the food. But indeed what's interesting, and I think of note, is that the highest number of causative factors of food incidents in 2015 in Ireland was allergens. And this is probably because we've become more sensitive to the need for us to make sure that we're looking at allergens. But indeed these are complaints, these have arisen as a result of either complaints to our advice line, information coming from our inspections, or indeed also our monitoring and surveillance programs within the FSAI. And we do a huge amount of monitoring and surveillance of the food system in Ireland over the course of the year, and these results are reported as well within our annual report and on our website on an ongoing basis. Specifically then, just looking at allergens, and this is where I'm going to finish, over the course of the last number of years, we've seen a massive spike in the number of allergen-related food incidents. As I just said, 67 last year, and indeed that number is specifically related to ones that were in Ireland. Some of the allergen alerts would, in that 67 number, would have come from allergen alerts from outside of Ireland, where products were coming into Ireland, and they were picked up by countries that were exporting into Ireland, or indeed they were picked up in other countries and the alert was put out. We have a system within the FSAI, particularly around allergen alerts, where we have people can subscribe. If you're an allergy sufferer, you can subscribe to a text messaging system or an SMS system, and we will send you an SMS if we're sending out an allergy alert, just to make sure you have, again, information in a timely manner, information that will help you make sure that you can live as healthy a lifestyle as you possibly can. So that is where I'm going to leave it. Thank you very much for your attention. I did have some Spanish, but muchas gracias again, Susana, for the invitation. Thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to the session in the afternoon where we'll discuss maybe a little bit more around this, but thank you.